Happy Tuesday! Hope everyone had a great Memorial Day weekend. Even though it is the weekend that essentially, quote unquote, officially but unofficially begins the summer season, as it were, it is a weekend and a day where we mark those, where we remember more accurately, those who put on our nation's uniform, went off to battle, and did not come home. It's all about their valiant sacrifice. We tend to forget that a bit too easily, but fortunately we remember enough about it to pay homage in our own individual way. At least I like to think so. But anyway, I'm fixing to do some moaning and groaning here, not about veterans who have made the ultimate sacrifice, but just some moaning and groaning about some things I think need to change in the trucking industry. And some of my opinions I'm about to express will be very popular among truck drivers, and some will be very unpopular among both truck drivers and businesses. So here we go. First and foremost, I believe it is time for trucking to experience some heavier regulation in terms exclusively pertaining to who can get a CDL in the first place. Firstly, I don't believe that allowing 18-year-olds to get a Class A CDL should be in anyone's wheelhouse in any capacity. At best, I think an 18-year-old should be able to qualify for either a Class C license or a Class B, as in Bravo, license, so they can drive a box truck. But the Class A should be something that you work up to and or you hit that magical age of 21 before you can attain it. That's my opinion. I think some states are kind of thinking that way. I think others are not. But I will also be completely honest in saying that I have not fully acquainted myself with the ins and outs of what the push to open up the opportunities for younger drivers to get CDLs actually looks like. So, make of that what you will. Secondly, I believe very firmly, now more than ever, that the only people in the United States who should be allowed to obtain a Class B or A license, commercial trucking license, should be people who can be proven to speak, read, and write the English language. If a person requires any sort of translation assistance, they cannot get a CDL in the U.S. until they can rectify that situation. I don't care where they came from, and that's my opinion. That's what I believe should happen. That's how I think it should be. The official language of aviation is English. I think the official language of trucking in the U.S. should also be English. Read, spoken, and written. Because I've had too many encounters with drivers who could not at all speak English, and one guy tried to speak to me through a translator app. Last year when I got backed into the two Russian drivers, they couldn't speak English enough to communicate with me clearly. They had to use translator apps, and quite honestly, that should not be in any capacity legal in the U.S. If you can't speak English, read English, or write English, you can't be a trucker in the U.S., at least as someone who is seeking to get a CDL in the U.S. Whether or not Canada and Mexico would follow that requirement for U.S. driving, that's a whole different kettle of fish, but that's what I think should happen. And I think that would go a long way towards perhaps improving the talent pool, perhaps, among U.S. drivers. Now, what about those drivers who already have licenses who can't speak English, read English, or write English? Well, that's going to be its own kettle of fish, because there is a constitutional block on what's called ex post facto, meaning passing a law that affects something that's already been allowed to happen. Now, when it comes to regulatory requirements and how ex post facto would actually come into play, that is a kettle of fish I am not qualified to stew. more to get it moved. Okay, well, that would make sense, but sometimes some folks just aren't going to do that, and that could lead to some really sticky situations in healthy freight markets currently, while making unhealthy freight markets perhaps more attractive, or drying those markets up completely because now all the loads are just being fought over that much more fiercely. I don't know. There's always going to be well, on the other hand, this could happen, or that could really play hell with my idealized situation. Another unpopular opinion for the business is lumper fees should be made illegal in terms of during the unload payment process. If you want to have an unload fee assigned to a load, whether it's grocery or a specialty product or chemicals or whatever else, that has to be paid by the shipper to the receiver, or by the receiver to the people doing the unload. The broker and the carrier should not in any capacity be involved in or responsible for unload fees. They should exclusively be the ones handling the movement of the goods from shipper to receiver, from origin to destination. And at that point, whatever happens above and beyond, that should never be the responsibility of the broker or the carrier, because quite honestly, I'm sick of paying broker for our lumper fees when I do grocery loads. That's why I actively avoid grocery freight, because lumper fees are always a pain in the backside, because they don't let you leave until they get their money. And whether you want to call it a scam or anything else, or some kind of quasi-mafia nonsense, whatever you want to call it whatever you will, but I don't like them, and they're a leftover from a bygone era that need to be corrected regulatory-wise. I mean, if you still want to have fees paid to unloaders to deal with specialty unloads, fine. Work it out without having to involve the carrier or the broker. The only time a carrier should have to pay a lumper fee is if it's a specialty unload because the trailer's been damaged and they have to pay to have the load transloaded, or there's another issue that comes up and then the load can't go to the initial destination. They have to pay to have it unloaded into a specialty warehouse or whatever. Those are the only two times where a lumper fee should at all be the responsibility of the carrier in any capacity. So yeah. Another unpopular opinion for business: diesel exhaust fluid should never, ever, ever be more expensive than diesel fuel. In fact, there should be a regulatory cap on the actual cost of DEF. It should never exceed a price that is more than 2/3 of the cost of 1 gallon of diesel. So if diesel is $3 a gallon, for example, then DEF should be not more than $2 per gallon of diesel, or per gallon of DEF. Because diesel exhaust fluid, as far as I'm aware, it's actually probably less complicated to make DEF than it is to make diesel fuel. And I think it's a scam at how expensive DEF is, and I think that needs to be investigated as to why it's being allowed to be priced that high. And because we have to use it thanks to California and their obscene, really, emissions regulations, that in my opinion need to be slapped down, we're stuck with it. And we're gonna be stuck with it until they can figure out some other way of making our exhaust cleaner that will allow us to eliminate the DEF system entirely, the current iteration of how it's working. Like, that stuff sucks. I hate it. It's annoying. And because the sensors, the NOx sensors, can occasionally go bad and derate you, it's your DPF system essentially is its own sort of ticking time bomb as to whether or not it's going to shut you down and ruin your week, if not your month, depending on how expensive the repair is. And of course, oh, by the way, you got to have those filters cleaned every now and again too, or replaced. watching, and I will see